Okay, so let's start by breaking down a little bit of what decoding actually looks like and what it means in the brain of a reader. So we talked about how we're building alphabetic awareness, phonemic awareness, concepts of print, automaticity, and then eventually feeding forward. So let's take a look at a word, the one that I mentioned before, understand. I want you to imagine that you've never seen this word before, but you do have some understanding of the different parts of the word. So what's going to happen is, if you've never seen this word before, or maybe you've seen it but you just haven't memorized it, you're going to be breaking this word down into its component parts. You can read it out loud with me. Imagine that you're a reader that's like still just figuring this out. Understand. Now, if you read with emergent readers, you're going to see them go through this process a lot, where they'll actually do what's called chunking. We'll maybe see them point underneath the letters. Understand. Or we might see them cover them up. Understand. So that is sort of the beginning process, and it's actually a very normal process of learning to read. The goal is that eventually you're going to begin to actually group the component parts so that you break them down into smaller pieces. Starting with, you might have yourself starting to see under and then stand. Instead of doing the st together, st and stand, you're going to start to group that. Then you might start seeing this word under. You're like, oh, I know this word, under. You're going to group it together. Now you just have understand. And then eventually what happens in your mind is you're able to start recognizing this word to where you can build some automaticity and get to the point where you see it and you just see understand. In fact, you might say you understand. But I would actually say that you are automatic, which is different than understanding. So that is one example of what decoding actually looks like in the brain. Let's look at a few more. Here's another word. Now, here we start to see some irregularities in the way the English language functions. Thank you to our colonizers before us who forced us to use this language. So here you have this tricky sound here. This O doesn't really make the O sound that we think it does with a silent E. It also doesn't make the ah, covering. We have to actually know this word cover really to make this work, and we have to have seen it before. And then we're going to break it down. So what we might do at first is go covering. Because we don't actually recognize that as a word, our brain is basically like, what? And we pause and we actually find ourselves struggling through it. So we really have to recognize this as a sight word. This is where automaticity becomes so important. And this is just a great example of why learning to read is actually an incredibly demanding cognitive task. And it makes sense that it takes all of us different amounts of time to get there. So here we have covering, and then eventually we're going to see it all together and start to recognize it as covering. Let's take a look at another one. I want you to pause right now, and with your partner, I want you to actually write down this word, and I want you to think about how you would break it down and work to decode it. Pause the video right here, write down the word, think about and talk about how you would break it down to decode it. Okay, so you might have had something like between, or maybe you saw tween here because you recognized that word to describe what you were not that long ago. Well, it was probably a while ago. Wasn't that long ago. Anyway, between. Now I want you to pause the video again and write down this word right here and practice decoding it also. Go. Interesting, right? It's actually pretty tricky to decode this word because the English language has a ton of irregularities in it. Now, most of our readers are probably able to decode this word because it's something you learn in elementary school. But with that being said, we all are at different stages in our development and also our language acquisition. So I might break this down as beautiful, and then I start to see beau as something that I might recognize. Beautiful, and eventually I see it as a whole word. And finally, now we have this word swipe, which also has this irregular I sound, which is going to be hard to figure out unless we have somebody actually helping us to practice reading. So that's an example of what decoding can look like with individual words. Take a moment now, and I would love for you to just turn and talk and summarize. What do you now see as some of the challenges of actually learning to decode words, and how does this impact your students? I want you to think about particular students that you've seen struggle with decoding. I recognize these are simpler words probably than what your students may be struggling with, but that also may not be the case. Either way, go ahead and share what is decoding, why is it important, and what does this process look like for your students?